Hello Revolution students, and welcome back to another video on the Russian Revolution area of Study 1. In this video I'm going to look at the Russo-Japanese War, which began in January 1904 when the Japanese launched a surprise attack against the Russian fleet at Port Arthur, and ended in August 1905. There is a very famous quote about why the Russians decided to start a war with Japan in Manchuria, and I will bring that up right now. So here it is, and it's attributed to V.K. Plev, who was the internal minister, a very powerful minister in the Tsarist government at the time. And he is supposed to have said, "You are not familiar with Russia's internal situation. We need a little victorious war to stem the tide of revolution." So according to this quote, the reason why the Russians started the Russo-Japanese War was in order to stop a potential revolution occurring in Russia itself. So that was one of the reasons why the war began, and it comes up now with the first reason here, a victorious war to avert the revolution. There were a number of other reasons as well. So the second major reason was a desire to annex Manchuria itself for, firstly, the Trans-Siberian Railway. So at this time, the railway itself, the Trans-Siberian Railway, had not been completed, so sections of it were still incomplete. So the Russians wanted Manchuria in order to extend the railway itself all the way down pretty much to Port Arthur. They also wanted to gain Manchuria, take over Manchuria, in order to have a new area for Russian peasants to settle and expand, take over land and grow more crops and so forth, as well as more markets for their manufactured goods. So they hoped that by taking over Manchuria, then it would be more easier to export their goods into China, Korea and Japan and other places in the region. The final main reason why the war was conducted was to obtain an ice-free port. Russia's main port, excluding Port Arthur itself, which was leased from the Chinese, so the Russians didn't have total control over that, they just sort of leased it for a time. Their main port was Vladivostok, and Vladivostok was on the Pacific coast, but it was further up the Pacific coast, and in winter it actually iced up a bit, and the Russians had to bring in ice-breaking ships in order to break up the ice and enable their ships to sail out of the harbour. So they did want an ice-free port, something they did not have. Of course, they had ports in European Russia, so St. Petersburg, Archangel, for example, but they all iced up over the winter as well. In the Black Sea in the south, the Crimean Peninsula and so forth, they had ports there, and there wasn't ice there in the winter, but the Black Sea was totally enclosed, so they couldn't sail out of the Black Sea because they couldn't sail through the Dardanelles, which were controlled by the Turks. So the Russians were like hemmed in. And then going back to that quote, that initial quote we looked at, which was supposedly from Plev, we're going to see later on some historical interpretations which show that Plev actually didn't say it, and they attribute that quote, or they blame Witt for actually wanting to start the war. And he was the minister for the economy and so forth, so Witt was very much after starting the war because he wanted to expand areas for Russia's industry and so forth, and for their exported goods. So here is a map of the major battles that occurred during the Russo-Japanese War. You can see here is Port Arthur, so that's the port that was attacked by the Japanese. The surprise attack began in January 1904. That eventually fell, I believe, by January 1905 or sometime around that time. And when that fell, that enabled the Japanese then to move their forces inland very easily from there as well. They were also bringing their forces, you can see here's Japan itself. They were shipping them over into Korea to fight the Russians in this area. So a number of battles occurred up and around here between the Russians and the Japanese. The most famous perhaps was the Battle of Mukden, which the Russians lost. The Japanese and the Russians suffered a similar number of casualties, but the Russians were the ones who retreated from there. The other major battle was a naval battle, which was the Battle of Tsushima, and that was very, very significant because it was in this battle that the Japanese Navy destroyed in one day the Russian Baltic fleet. And I'll just go over to the next slide, and this is also related to the Battle of Tsushima. Once the Russian fleet had been destroyed, then there was no way for the Russians to stop the Japanese from shipping their troops and supplies from Japan into Manchuria itself. So this is quite an interesting map because this shows the route of the Russian Baltic fleet when it sailed in left European Russia in October 1904, and it sailed all the way down here. When it got to around Gibraltar, around here in Morocco, it actually split in two, and you can see Admiral Feckel's arm. He went the nice easy route through the Suez Canal and got a bit of sun and so forth to the top of Madagascar a bit quicker, and then the rest of the fleet had to go all the way down through past the coast of Africa until they reached Madagascar, and then they joined up together and they sailed together, and they eventually reached the Straits of Tsushima in May 1905, and it was the first day that they met the Japanese fleet. The Japanese fleet just blew them out of the water. All right. So what were the consequences of the war for Russia and Russian society? So each Japanese victory, and there were numerous Japanese victories, increased further social unrest in Russia. Okay, the Russian people themselves got angrier and angrier at the incompetence of the Tsarist regime. And with this unrest came further political assassinations, and the most famous at this time was of Plehve himself. He was blown up by social revolutionaries who threw a bomb at the carriage he was travelling in. He died in July 1904, not long after the defeat at Yalu River in April 1904. With the loss of Port Arthur in January 1905, it contributed to a further increase in social unrest. At this time, very soon afterwards, Father Gapon did his famous march on the Winter Palace with all the demonstrators, which led to Bloody Sunday when many of them were shot. And in his petition, which he took with him to the Winter Palace, he actually referred to the Russo-Japanese War and stopping the Russo-Japanese War, and just stating how unpopular it was for the Russian people. So, as you can see here, in his petition, Father Gapon refers to the bureaucracy drawing the country into a shameful war and demands termination of the war according to the will of the people. Another consequence, well, it showed the incompetence of the Tsarist regime and undermined the Tsar's credibility as a leader. The Tsar didn't travel to the Far East, to Manchuria, and lead the military himself, so he didn't assign himself or make himself commander-in-chief as he did in World War One. So the Tsar wasn't directly responsible for the defeats. His generals were, who were fighting over there, but it still impacted upon his own credibility as a leader and diminished it. Further consequences of the war. So it contributed to some of these revolutionary groups who played a key role in the 1905 revolution, such as the Union of Unions, which was led by the liberal leader Milyukov, who later became the leader of the cadets. And then Milyukov also played a very significant role in the Dumas themselves, the four Dumas, between April 1906 and up to Feb 1917. But also he played a role, he held important positions within the provisional government as well, so I think he was a Minister of War for a time. And in the Declaration of the Union of Unions, they referred to the Tsarist government as a terrible menace. They called for a constituent assembly. They also called for an end to the war as well. With the Battle of Tsushima and the defeat of the Russian fleet, This was quickly followed by the Potemkin Mutiny in 1905. There are about another 10 or more mutinies, both in the Navy and in the Army, after this most famous mutiny. The Potemkin Mutiny, that was, if you haven't studied this yet, you will. That is when the battleship, the Prince Potemkin, in the Black Sea, its crew mutinied against the commanders there over poor working, over harsh discipline, as well as poor food, borscht, disgusting like soupy thing. So they mutinied and contributed to a whole lot of other mutinies that occurred. The consequence of these mutinies was that the Tsar actually lost full control of the military. He didn't trust in the military as much as he would have prior to the revolution, and because he lacked full control of the military, it made it more difficult for him to actually crush the revolution. And particularly once we got into like October through to December 1905, when that general strike occurred. And the general strike went for 3 months because one of the reasons was the Tsar didn't trust in the military to be able to crush it. He feared that if he sent the soldiers in, that they would actually join the revolutionaries. And then finally, that last point, the war, along with internal unrest, contributed to the Tsar's issuing of the October Manifesto, that very, very famous document in which the Tsar promised to create a legislative assembly, a parliament with law-making powers, and which in April 1906 he broke that promise when he opened the First Duma and issued the fundamental laws, which restated his own law that restated that only the Tsar had law-making powers. So the parliament, which the Russians called the Duma, and there were 4 of them between April 1906 and February 1917, they were pretty much advisory bodies. They did not have any law-making powers themselves, and this was another cause of social unrest and anger towards the Tsar because he refused to implement or create a democratic system of government within Russia. Okay, so that's all the consequences of the war. Let's just have a look at a couple of images now, and I want to have a look at some of these images because, as far as I'm aware, there has not as yet been a section of source analysis within the exams, end of year exams, which has been devoted to images on the Russo-Japanese War. There's certainly been some questions on the Russo-Japanese War, but not sources or images as yet. So just in case that does occur in the future, it'd be good to have a look at some of these images now. So this one here, this is one example. This was from an actual, it's from an American newspaper. It was done, what's the date? March 1904. So it was after the Japanese did their surprise attack on the Russian fleet at Port Arthur, and it just reflects, from a US standpoint, the Japanese defeating the Russians. And you can see it's quite obvious there, Port Arthur, the Japanese sumo wrestler. They refer to him as jiu-jitsu, but anyway. And the Russian soldier being whacked in the throat and defeated. Another image. So this one, February 1904. And this image, as well as the following one we're going to look at, it refers to or alludes to the way that Russia was viewed prior to the Russo-Japanese War by the major powers. Prior to the Russo-Japanese War, Russia was seen as a very a strong militaristic nation, very powerful army and so forth, and many European countries and Western countries were afraid to try to take on Russia because they feared they would be too strong to defeat. This cartoon, however, is showing that that is no longer the case after the surprise attack in January 1904. So it shows that it depicts the Russians as a bomb, and you've got a Japanese soldier here, and the Japanese soldier comes in and he takes the plug off the bomb, and what you would expect to happen is that for that bomb to explode, but it doesn't. So it's not that dangerous. It doesn't explode, and the threat of explosion, all it really is bluster and wind. It's not dangerous at all. The next image follows or continues with this theme, and it's quite a nice one. So very, very clear. You've got in the world's eye in 1904, prior to the Russo-Japanese War, the Russians were seen as very powerful and the Japanese were seen as very weak. By 1905, however, in the world's eye, the Japanese had become very, very strong and the Russians had become very, very ragged, small and weak. Okay, and the next image I'm going to show you is actually one from the Japanese perspective, and it depicts the Russians as an imperialist power, an evil octopus with its tentacles extending out from Russia to all neighbouring countries and slowly taking them over and so forth. And wherever the Russian tentacles take over, they cause death and destruction, as shown by these little skulls, which may be a little bit hard for you to see, but those little white things there are skulls. And then the artist is showing the Russian octopus gripping Turkey, Persia, Tibet, China. You can see this tentacle extending all the way through Manchuria down here, and then the Japanese are on the side here defending or trying to defend against this Russian imperialist octopus. So from a Japanese perspective, they were fighting against an imperialist foe who was trying to take over the world pretty much. So the Japanese were right in what they were doing, fighting the Russians. Okay, let's have a look at a couple of historical interpretations now. So the first one is from Richard Pipes or Pipes, and it goes back to what we were talking about with Plehve and Witt and who wanted the war and who didn't want the war as much. So this is Richard Pipes' view. It has since become known that Plehve did not want a war. In fact, Witt himself bore a great deal of the blame for the conflict. As the main architect of Russia's industrialization, he was eager to ensure foreign markets for her manufactured goods. So Richard Pipes lays the blame squarely at the feet of Witt. This next historical interpretation is from the HCPSU, the History of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union. And it writes, the Tsarist government was pushed to this war by the big bourgeoisie, so the big capitalists, the powerful capitalists within Russia, which was seeking new markets for their products, and by the more reactionary sections of the landlord class. So a very Marxist class-orientated view of who started the war. It was classes, it was the big powerful bourgeoisie and some of the landlord class that started the war. For Richard Pipes, he blames at least Witt, if not others. Okay, I hope you have found this video on the Russo-Japanese War useful for your study of the Russian Revolution, area of study 1, and I will see you next time. Goodbye.